We are so pleased to have David Giwerc with us today. His bio is on the back of your agenda, so you can read all the details about David. When we started talking about what we wanted to do for this conference this year and talked about social interactions, David was one of the people that we thought about who could speak well to that topic. As a coach, as a trainer of coaches, this is something that David works with day in and day out, and so he knows a lot of it. We also are very, very, very honored that he left a day early to come here from Albany, New York, so he wouldn't miss the snowstorm. We very much appreciate that. David.
Thank you, Kathy. Hello, everybody. I have to start off by being honest. Honesty is an important value for me. I have to thank my wife for getting here because I started hyper-focusing the day before during my work, and when she said we really ought to get going as the weather reports were coming in, she said we really ought to get going as she's hearing what's going to happen in Boston and New York and upstate New York. And I said, I just got a real good feeling that this is going to work out and I can get through this. And she said, and she grabbed me and we left a day early. So I want to thank my wife Marla for getting me here. I also, and for so many more things, and see, I'm making some social connections, and I'm also brown-nosing really well. I want to thank Chad for inviting me, Marie Paxson for inviting me, and the board, and I want to thank somebody that, if not for the work that she did, and really catching me off guard and saying, I just want you to know I put your name in for this, and I really want you to do it. Cheryl Greenfield, I'd like you to stand up, Cheryl, please. And it's because of Cheryl that I'm here today, and glad to be. This is a wonderful conference. So we're gonna be talking about transforming ADHD stress, the invisible challenges of ADHD and executive function. I use executive function singularly, sorry George, only when I'm referring to the self-regulation. But there are functions, there are 6 categories. I like to use Russ Barkley's work and Tom Brown's work. And so I'm going to, when I refer to executive function singularly, George, because I think he made a great point, I'm referring to self-regulation. So I just want to make that distinction. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to see some coaching models. What we're going to do is I'm going to talk in different language, coaching language that we can take the scientific validated evidence, the stuff that you've learned about ADHD, and put it in language and visuals and models and things that you could explain to a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old. And hopefully you'll all leave here having another perspective of ADHD and executive function in a way that you could explain to everyone, because part of the challenge of social connection is not only knowing how your own ADHD shows up, but it's the ability to explain it to others. It's the ability to get the support from others so that they understand it. So those of you who are here who don't have ADHD, you are just as important as the people who do have it, because this is a genetic challenge, it's a family challenge, and it's a cooperative challenge where we have to be able to communicate. So we're going to use those models. We're going to talk about emotional intelligence. What is emotional intelligence? In simplistic terms, it's the ability to pause in the moment, or inhibit in the moment, pause in the moment, and identify what's the emotion that I'm feeling right now. By the way, research shows that only about 1/3 of the world has that ability. It's not just people with ADHD. Most people don't know how to pause in the moment and identify, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm happy, I'm sad, whatever it is, they don't have that ability. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about strategies that you could teach a very young child all the way to an adult. Because if you can't pause to pay attention to what you're paying attention to, and what you're paying attention to is I'm angry, I'm upset, you can't self-regulate, you can't connect. So these are very important things. These are models and tools that connect all age groups, but they make a lot of sense. And they're based in science, too. And then lastly, how to create clear social intentions. What's my intention as I go to the party? What's my intention as I go to the meeting with my bosses? What's the intention of communicating with my wife? Clear social intentions, but because ADHD is a challenge of memory, it's a challenge of externalizing memory. You can't rely on your internal memory. We're going to show you some creative prompts, some creative ways that my clients over the years remember. What was I supposed to do again? How am I supposed to do that? And they're just starting points. What we're going to give you today is a foundation. Now, there's a little story I have to tell here that makes sense of this. There was a boy, young boy, very rambunctious, ADHD, but very hypersensitive, great radar, great intuition, but because he got bored in class, he was very impulsive, and he would ask a lot of questions, and he would interrupt a lot, but he was a good kid, but the teacher couldn't stick with her lesson plans. So she said, Johnny, come here. I got a project for you. And she had ripped up a map of the world and said, Johnny, go put this map together for me, in the hopes that he would take the whole class to put the map together. So Johnny's intuition said, she's just trying to get me to do something so I can't be in class, but I'm going to figure out something. So he took the pieces, she put them in the side of the room, and he turned over a couple of pieces, and there was as he put the pieces together, there was a picture of a face. And he said, oh, this is easy. This is a human being. I'll just put the human being together. He put it together, he turned it over, and the map was together also. So 15 minutes later, he went in and he showed her, he said, how did you do that? And he just smiled. Unique brain wiring. ADHD doesn't mean you're broken, it just means I do things in my own creative way. And that's the real message that I want to get here today, that in order to have social connections, you have to embrace your unique brain wiring. You have to embrace the way you do things. You might not do it the same way everyone else does, but there's a way you do it, and it's your natural recurring patterns of success. We're going to talk about talents and strengths today, but these are just some of the things you have to do for social connection. Social connection is the highest level of executive function because you have to do so many things. You have to pause, you have to pay attention, you have to identify what's going on, you have to see the emotions, you have to understand the messages, you have to do so many things, and a lot of people take it for granted that a kid or an adult with ADHD that hasn't learned the discipline of learning those signals, that may be thrown into a situation they've never been before, don't have those skills. Can they learn them? 100 zillion% yes. They can learn them, and I don't believe it, I know it because I've seen it. But it takes discipline. George talked about that today, that discipline of being able to identify the situations first. If there's anything that I want to talk about here, it's identify the situations that get in your way of having a positive self-image. Now, we know that this is a real problem, positive self-image. Being able to observe yourself. Ari, if you ever want to listen to a great talk, Ari does a talk on metacognition. Embracing your inner observer, being able to watch your own movie as it's going on and being able to say, wow, that movie really sucks. I really need to change that movie, rather than getting emotionally attached to it. You got to learn to detach from it and keep distance. Empathy, respect, communication skills, these are all things that are very important, and the ability to self-regulate. How do we do that? And the biggest thing is knowing your ADHD. Education is critical because ADHD shows up differently for everyone. It's very situational. We're going to talk about research, specific things on how ADHD shows up and what the causes are, so that you can, instead of paying attention to what you can't do, wouldn't it be great if you could pay attention to what you can do? But our brains don't work that way. We'd rather pay attention to problems, and we'd rather pay attention to negativity because that's the way our brain's wired. We're going to talk about that. And what's the story you're telling yourself? Is it a healthy story or is it a bad story? Unfortunately, research shows us that most ADDers from a very young age have a very unhealthy story. If they have friends, it's one or two, and those friends may or may not be their friends. They don't feel connected. And you know, it's not the quality, but it's not the quantity, it's the quality of friendship. And as they get older, as they become adolescents, it's hard for them to sustain those relationships because they haven't learned the discipline of what does it mean to be a friend. When I was a kid, and I'm 57, as a matter of fact, I was just 57 February 4th, and 57 years young, okay, because age is a thought. When we were kids growing up, my mom said, go out, we got on our bikes, you went to your friend's door, you rang the doorbell, and you played. And somebody in the group may have been a little different, maybe eccentric, but we all got along. There wasn't the social media. There wasn't the internet. There wasn't, as a matter of fact, I remember when the calculator was invented. How many of us remember that, huh? Calculator, now you can get them for free, 250 bucks, Texas Instruments. I was a sucker, I bought one. Then we become young adults, and we go from high school to college, and there's a transition. But if mommy and daddy are doing everything for us, all of a sudden we hit the brick wall. How do I get through it? And then when we become adults, I was president of the Attention Deficit Disorder Association, which is the world's largest adult ADHD organization. And Evelyn Green, who is the current president, former president of CHAD, we worked together and we did research. And what the research said is that 80% of people with ADHD feel like life is hopeless. Hopeless. And that ignited something in me because these were people that felt they couldn't sustain relationships. Now, if any of you have ever been to an ADA conference, and I hope you'll go, there's one in July, you will find Heart and Head and Harmony. It's like a spiritual revival of people with ADHD. There are 500 people with 2,500 conversations going on, and we could follow every one of them. And that is the truth, but it's heart and head. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're not going to just talk about the things in your head. We're going to talk about harmony of heart and head, because we haven't cultivated habits of the heart, because kids from a very young age are focusing on problems, they're focusing on testing, they're focusing on grades, and they're focusing on weaknesses. And we've got the research to prove it. We've got to reverse it, and reversing it takes a lot of work. And that story isolates them. They feel very isolated. If you feel that you're not cutting it, if you're not meeting the standards of performance at school or work, you feel very isolated, you're going to feel rejected, and you're not going to even feel like going out to make friends. And that's how a lot of people feel. They feel like, the metaphor I often use is like it's like taking a drop out of the ocean. When you take a drop out of the ocean and you put it in the glass, what happens? It evaporates. But we're all part of the ocean. We've got to go back in. We may be uniquely precipitated, so to speak, a unique shape, a unique drop, but we can't take ourselves out of it because we're different. We've got to be interconnected with the ocean. We're all connected and we're all unique and we're all different. And ADHD is a unique brain wiring. It does not mean you're broken. And it doesn't mean you're broken. And I use this photo because I was in the building business with my father. Now, you want to talk about a prescription for hell? Take two people working together with undiagnosed ADHD. That was my dad and I. And he dumped all the stuff that I hated to do on me. Okay, but what he did teach me is for a house to be well built, you have to build a very strong foundation. You don't chintz on the foundation. You make the footing wider, you make the footing stronger, because when a weather comes across, it's going to knock it right down. What we're talking about today is strong foundation. Strong foundation of skills, sets, and understanding. Strategies don't work if you don't understand what I'm talking about today. And our natural tendency is to go for tactics. What's the strategy? What's the quick fix? The pill doesn't give you the skill. The pill only puts you on a level playing field if it's diagnosed properly. But these foundational pieces that you're going to learn help you build the foundation so when the turbulence of life shows up, you'll be able to navigate. Your house won't fall down. We got to break the chain. So what we're going to talk about is breaking the chain, because our kids are growing up in a world with more pressure, more performance. Suicide rates are out the yin-yang. They have never been higher than they are before. We have the most affluent societies in the world, and why aren't people any happier? It's because what they're paying attention to, because what you pay attention to will grow, and we have to change the story. This is a foundational piece. This is one of about 10 models we use at the Academy, and I've used this models with every age group to explain how does your brain work, how do beliefs impact it, and what's your mission. That our brains are magical machines, but what fuels the brain are the dominant thoughts that we have in any given moment. The thoughts that you create in any given moment create neurological weight, which is a fancy way of saying you create neurochemicals by the most dominant thoughts that you pay attention to. So when you wake up and your first thought is, I can't, I won't, I never could, that creates negative chemicals which impact your ability to function. It impacts your machine. And we're going to talk about all three of these, the machine in terms of executive function, because it's ADHD that impacts executive function. Okay? I think what Ari said today was right. This is an executive function disorder. But how does ADHD get in the way of those functions is critical. But also being able to pay attention to what you pay attention to in the moment means if a dominant belief doesn't serve you well, you have to be able to ask the question, how is what I am paying attention to serving me? How? I mean, questioning, George brought that up, questioning is very critical, the right kinds of questioning. But can you imagine if every day you had a strong emotion and you felt it and were able to identify and you could pause and say, how is being angry at this person serving me? How is focusing on this negative part of my life serving me? That question is so powerful. It creates the dialogue. How that dialogue occurs, we're going to talk about today. Machine mind. If machine and mind are in harmony, then and only then do you go after your mission. What do I mean by that? We're going to talk a little bit more when we get to the mission. Think about the kids that go to school today. They have no understanding between a need or a value, a standard or a boundary. What are my values? What do I honor? Who am I? How do I define myself? Nobody taught me what a need or a value was in school. I don't know. Did anybody ever come up to any of you and say, hey, what do you need to be yourself? What are your key values in life? That's the mission. And if your machine and mind are not working well, that is, your brain is not connected with beliefs, and we're going to talk about a higher concept, actual knowings of experiences that the machine and mind work in harmony, you're not available to say, who am I? Because you are pressured into performing based on standards that have been shoved down your throat from a young age. You don't give yourself the ability to say, I get to be who I want to be, and you can't make me be who I don't. Muhammad Ali said that when he was named Cassius Clay. You can't make me be who I don't want to be because I get to choose who I want to be. That's a very powerful statement. But kids today don't feel that way. And 57 years of my age, I remember a time when I didn't feel that way. It's gotten worse. We've got to pause and teach our kids that they are the commander of their command center. That they have this command center, but they're the commander of it. They're the boss. And nobody teaches them that. So this is, I think, the greatest thing in the history of neuroscience, neuroplasticity. That every experience, every thought, every sense, every mechanism that you experience in your life has the ability to support or create the architecture of your brain. You have the ability to create an architecture. Somebody asked the question today, new neural pathways. We didn't used to think that. We now know through research at UCLA in Sweden, the more you pay attention to something, the more you reinforce it, the more you have the ability to create a neural pathway in your brain, a new one. So every experience, every thought, everything you do, consciously, and sometimes unconsciously, if you can change it to conscious, can create new neural pathways. I want you to think about something, a question. What's the last thing you do 5 minutes before you go to bed? Do you pay attention to problems or do you pay attention to how you want to live your life? Last 5 minutes before you go to bed. Most powerful time of the day. Last 5 minutes. And when you do, and you have a mantra that talks about some of the things that we're going to talk about today, you will be amazed at what begins to manifest. But we don't. That last 5 minutes, a lot of us think problems, and I'm just as guilty of this. It's a discipline. What's the mantra of meaning? Viktor Frankl was talked about. If you want to read a book that talks about meaning, read his book In Man's Search of Meaning. Viktor Frankl, who created logotherapy, therapy based on meaning. Well, it's about the subconscious and it's about the messages you tell yourself. Every one of you, every adult in here, whether you know it or not, has 100 billion, in full brain maturity, has 100 billion neurons, or chemical factories, that make all the chemicals that allow you to function, like dopamine and serotonin and all these neurochemicals that you hear. And each one of them are connected to 10 to 15,000 passages, or pathways that they connect to each other. Well, you don't have to be a brain scientist to figure out that's a whole lot of processing options. Trillions. Now why am I sharing this with you? Think about the kid that goes to school every day. Shut up and listen. Don't move around. Don't ask too many questions. Do it my way or the highway. And if you do, you'll be considered above average. We have trillions. You don't have to find all trillions of them, but you have to find the way your unique brain wiring works. We believe in coaching, it's about finding what already works. Don't pay attention to what you can't do. We do have to do some of that, but it starts from a place of paying attention to what is it that you already can do and do well and make it stronger, just the opposite. And there's reasons for that, which you're going to see in a little bit with research. And this is the research. Nora Valkow, National Institute Drug Addiction Director at the National Institute of Mental Health. 9-year study. I don't know why more people don't refer to this study, but here's what she found. I don't think this is a surprise to any of you. Hello? People with ADHD can't generate the same degree of enthusiasm as other people for activities they don't automatically find appealing or interesting or stimulating. It's about brain activation. Tell me one kid that's going to get their brain activated by paying attention to boring weaknesses. And what do we do in school? This is your area of greatest opportunity. Focus on what you can't do. Love that little kid, don't you? It's an interest deficit. Now, I want to make a real important distinction here. It's not okay to just pay attention to things that are interesting, because at the Academy, we define anything that's interesting are those things that stimulate your brain. Well, interesting doesn't always mean good, does it? Interesting means gambling and drug addiction and going 200 miles an hour and getting another driving ticket, or all the things that are stimulating. What we also say is we have a model, we don't have time to show it, but in this model called the I model, where everything begins with the letter I, you have interest and intention. And what is intention? It's creating a beneficial path, a purpose, a better future, by paying attention to what you can do that's stimulating and engaging with a positive intention. And we're going to talk about intention because it's an executive function challenge. It's hard to create an intention if you don't have a context, if you don't have a memory of what that means, or you have trouble getting it. But what we do know is what gets the ignition going is interest. When you match interest with intention and then add strengths, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, you got a powerful engine that's all revved up to go. Sometimes it's hard to put the brakes on, though. But that's another issue. But at least you got the engine going. At least you're getting up out of bed. At least you feel a purpose in your life. At least you know how to activate your brain. Now, I don't think any of you have ever seen anything like this, and it may seem a little busy, but this is called processing modes. And this is not integrated nearly enough in school, and most people don't know it. And I'm going to give you 2 questions to think about. But before I give you those 2 questions, just know these are the ways that at the Academy, that over the last 17 years with all the clients I've worked at, these are the things that we do in order to process information and take in. Some of us are visual. We need to see it. Some of us need to hear it. Some of us need to touch it. And depending on the situation, these processing modes change. Some of us think that hypersensitivity is a weakness. Let me tell you something. Hypersensitivity can be the greatest strength you ever had in terms of empathy, in terms of feeling for another person. That as a boy, the beliefs that I grew up with, men don't cry, men don't communicate. And I grew up in a family, we hugged, we kissed, we cried. Everybody thought I was nuts because I felt for the dog on the street. I felt for the cat. I felt for the person. My emotional intelligence was high, but I was told it was a fault for 38 years of my life until I was diagnosed with ADHD. And many of the clients, no matter what age they are, they don't realize that some of the challenges, quote unquote challenges that they have, are in fact strengths. Hypersensitivity, hyperfocus. These are things that when integrated in the right way can access positive energy. So now we're going to talk about the machine here. We're still in the machine. And we're talking about Russ Barkley's view and Thomas Brown's view of executive function as self-regulation, which means we direct something at ourselves. We're not thinking about anybody else. It's not selfish to think of yourselves. We're directing something at ourselves. We're looking at our behavior to make a better future. We're pausing in the moment to say, what is it that I can do to change my behavior to move me in a better direction, in a better future? And future and intention is a challenge for people with ADHD if you don't have any memory, positive context, anything positive to focus on that you can say, here's my hindsight, here's my memory, what will that help me do with my foresight or the future? Okay? So, here's the first one. 6 things we do to self-regulate, 6 categories. You'll notice I'm using a lot of visuals. I hope that doesn't bother some of you. I'm sure it doesn't, but I'm using different processing styles here. I'm talking, I'm speaking, I'm moving, I got pictures. There's something in here for everybody. Take the pieces that you like as I'm presenting today. Notice what's working for you. whether you have ADHD or not. Notice the things when I talk about processing modes, I didn't give you the 2 questions because here's why. I'm going to give them to you now because I want you to pause to think about them. So on those 6 styles of processing styles, the first question is, what is it that I have to do in order to pay attention and sustain focus on this? What is it that I have to do to pay attention, pause, stop, pay attention, and sustain focus long enough to process it, to begin to make sense of it? And the second question is, what do I have to...
Just a minute, we're writing it down.
Oh, you're not... You can't write that fast? What's wrong with you? I'll do it again. I'll do it again. So what is it that I have to do in order to pay attention and sustain focus? Everybody got that? And sustain focus. Once we can do that, the second question is, now that I can pay attention to and sustain focus, what is it that I have to do in order to understand it? Understand it. Now, why is this so important? Because if you go from a place of weakness and problem and try to figure that out, you're going to spend a whole lot of negative energy. And these executive functions only have a limited amount of energy. So why would you use it to drain yourself? How about looking at the things that already work for you? How do I pay attention to the book? How do I pay attention to the TV show? How do I pay attention to the program? Okay, I'll give you one quick example of how this works. As a young child myself, and many of my clients were like this, I was a kinesthetic learner. A lot of boys, hyperactivity, cognitively and physically. What do we do to boys that move around? We punish them. Don't move your leg, sit down, shut up, don't ask too many questions. They're actually punished for the natural way they learn. Let them move around. I broke 2 couches. In my book, Permission to Proceed, I talk about how I broke 2 couches by the time I was 9 because I rocked so vigorously in order to pay attention because I was a kinesthetic learner. So my grandmother got smart and she bought me a rocking chair, okay? And I still have the rocking chair. I still have it because sometimes that motion helps me pay attention. And what did I have to do to understand it? And by the way, I share this story with my clients that say, oh my God, that's me. This is only one kind. There are people that need to see a picture. There are people that have to ask a question, and they are denied this. The kid that asks a question out of order, and the teacher says, that's not appropriate. You're not paying attention. And you just lost that kid in school. And you just lost him socially in the same situation when he's in a social situation, and he can't pay attention because he doesn't understand how his brain works. So you put him in a boring situation socially. What's going to happen to that kid? He's not available. You've got to find situations and help them identify them before they happen. And we can do this at a very young age. We can say, what is it that you do well? We can acknowledge it. We can give them feedback, but we don't. And the second piece that I had to do was, as I was rocking, I sang my notes. I sang them to myself because I was an auditory learner. I didn't have anybody to mirror it. Mirroring back to your kids when they talk, just sitting there and repeat, what I'm hearing you say is, it sounds like this is what you mean. I'm noticing you're angry. Do you know how powerful that is? Watch your kids look at you like, what's gotten into her? She's listening to me. And then mirroring it back is one of the most powerful skills you can give a kid because their wheels are churning and they have nowhere to process it. It's stuck in the prison of their stomach, their heart, their head. They need to get it out. Mirroring and reflecting is a coaching skill we talk about all the time. And we do it, if we know they're visual, we use metaphors. If we know that they're kinesthetic, we use motion. We use music. Music and exercise are so important to learning. And some kids, the parents don't understand. They say, turn the damn thing down. Turn the TV off. That's their white noise. That helps them put the brakes on. You got to find out what is it that I have to do to pay attention and what is it that I have to do to learn. Now, we use some unique ways of learning how to pause, learning how to inhibit. We call these identifiers. These are distinctions. These are tools. May not work for some of you, but it's just to get creative. I can use this with kids, any age group. And I use the example, if you're in the desert and you know it's 105 degrees in Arizona and you only got 1 bottle of water and you don't pause to think about it and you gulp the whole thing down, oh boy, you're in a heap of trouble. You may not survive. That's how people with ADHD feel. They gulp it all down, they do something reactive, and there's nothing left. And then they have to suffer the consequence. It's the difference between reacting and responding, so that when you're responding, you're sipping it, you're savoring it. You can't take hot chocolate and gulp it down. Because if you do, you're in another kind of trouble. I've never seen anybody gulp hot tea or hot chocolate. You got to sip it and savor it and take it in. And when we sip it, we are able to respond. We're able to put the brakes on. And I've had kids call me up, oh, Mr. Giwerc. Please don't call me Mr. Giwerc. Okay, Mr. Giwerc, I was gulping today. I was gulping. I got in trouble. And he tells me, okay, so how are we going to sip? How are we going to learn to pause? And we're going to talk about emotional regulation, how you have to learn to pay attention to your bodies. And if you can pause and pay attention to what you're paying attention to, you can have self-awareness. Two of the biggest challenges of ADHD, inhibition and modulation, as George talked about. Inhibition, the ability to pause and pay attention to what we're paying attention and not beat ourselves up, because we get very attached to the thought or the emotion. And when we're attached as opposed to detached and we can't distance ourselves, we get attached to the emotion in the social situation, in the personal situation. If you go in and somebody looks at you the wrong way, which I used to do when I was younger, and think that they hate me, I have no opportunity for social connection. Instead of saying, I noticed that something's bothering you about me, would you like to tell me what that is? Most of the time it was nothing. It was all in my head. So we got to get out of our heads and we got to learn to pause and pay attention. Say, how is paying attention to this person not liking me serving me, no matter what age? Doesn't matter. This goes all the way. And the sooner we teach it, the more it gets reinforced as they get older. Unfortunately, like myself, some of us didn't learn about our ADHD until their late 30s, 40s, 50s. We have a woman in the program, 77. And you know what she told me? I feel like a little kid again. I understand things about myself that I never did before. Another way of looking at attention, cognitive hyperactivity. We go into a social situation, we're bombarded. What do I say? What do I do? What do I ask? What do I focus? You focus on one piece at a time. The brain, the human brain, although many of you may think that you can pay attention to more than one thing at one time, multitasking is the biggest farce that ever was invented on the earth, because you can't do anything well when your attention is subdivided. You can only pay attention to one PIECE, piece of anything, with quality, and if you learn to do that, that will give you PEACE all the time. Because you know what we do? We put a lot of pressure on ourselves. We get these huge lists. Oh my God, I got to do all 29 million of these things simultaneously. It's in your head. You can only have success by doing it one piece at a time, no matter what. Neurologically, it's impossible to do anything else. Scientific fact tells us. So when I share this, I can see my clients say, oh, take the pressure right off them. Pressure and boredom and weakness and stress, these things don't allow the brain to function. So we have to pay attention to one PIECE at a time, and we'll have peace all the time. Now, can you imagine if you have a memory in your brain where you're not trying to be funny, but there's something in there that you want to get out and you can't access it? How frustrating. And the only thing you can access is what you can't do, as opposed to what you can do. And you're in a social situation, and what was it I was supposed to do again? And when was I successful? And what about the time I showed gratitude? And what about the time I took the dog off the street and loved them? And you can't remember any of them because they're not captured. Every one of my clients keeps a success diary. A success diary. And we start the session off, tell me what successes you had this week. Do you know that that takes more work than looking at weakness? Research shows that for every negative experience you have to have 5 positive experiences that you consciously take in and process. 5-to-1 ratio. And what do we spend most of our day doing? Paying attention to criticism and weakness. I fortunately did not grow up in that environment. I had a grandmother who was a Holocaust survivor that only said, I'm not letting you look at one damn weakness, I'll beat it into your head. And she did. And I resented it at the time, but now I realize what she was trying to do. She was trying to get me to embrace the goodness within me, whether it was an attribute or strengths, and she never let me look at weakness, never. And to this day, I don't like negativity. I'm not saying I'm not negative like everybody else, because I am, but I know how dangerous it is for the brain, how dangerous it is for the soul, and how dangerous it is for the spirit of a person that only focuses on what they can't do and their weaknesses and problems, and has to meet standards of performance based on pressure from day one in school. We've got a real problem with our school systems, and boy, we could talk about that all day. But here's the thing, they have to go home. They have to go home. I had a loving home, and no matter how much I screwed up, I knew I would be loved. And that is the greatest ingredient for any one of your kids to have social success, to model, no matter what you do wrong or how bad. We're going to talk about it, you're going to get feedback, but we love you. We don't love the behavior, but we love you. And we're going to fix the behavior, but you're going to fix it. And we're going to empower you to fix it. That's what coaching's about. We don't give the answers. We make the observations, we ask the questions, we share these tools, and then we say, what are you going to do? But you can't have foresight if you don't have positive hindsight. Your GPS, the GPS, think about the GPS in your car. You know where you've gone, you know where you are, and you know where you're going. But in the human brain, if you don't know where you've gone before, you don't have the ability nor the confidence to go forward. And that's why we procrastinate. Because if your dominant memories are of a negative nature, that doesn't give you confidence. And if you have no memory, which sometimes happens, because if you couldn't pause to pay attention to it long enough, you couldn't register it in your brain. There is no memory. That's how memory works. You have to sustain focus long enough to put it into your memory. Mind's voice, verbal, like I just did it. I verbally processed. So many people I know with ADHD are verbal processors. And why is this important in relationships and social connection? Well, think about newlyweds or think about new friends. And you've made a decision on something, and so all of a sudden the person that has ADHD starts processing something that's totally different than the decision you've made, but they're just processing it. And the other person thinks, oh God, he's changing his decision, now I'm going to have to change everything, and nobody talks about it. There's assumptions that are made. There's an assumption that because he's talking or she is talking out loud that we have to change everything. Let me tell you how important this is. If you just mirror it back and say, so is this what you're saying? Are you just talking out loud or are you changing your mind? Do you know how powerful that question is? No, I was just talking out loud. Watch the stress go out in the other person. We don't communicate. We don't give the feedback. So for verbal processors that speak out loud, listen to them. Mirror it back. So what I'm hearing you say, is this what you want to do or is this what you want to do? Are you changing your mind or are you just speaking out loud? Verbal processing means we got a whole lot of great stuff going on up here, but it gets locked in if we don't have anybody to process with. Now this also means technology. I wrote the whole book, Permission to Proceed, or most of it, using voice-activated software. Naturally Dragon Speaking, Preferred 10. To me, it was the most magical invention in the history of mankind because everything that was on here, I got to see on a video screen for the first time in my life. And that's what kids don't get to do. That this software is there are so many, if you're visual, there's mind mapping programs, Mind Manager. There's all kinds of software today to make learning and communication better than it's ever been before. So this is important. When they process, listen and give it back to them. The mind's heart, regulating emotion. This is where the problem begins with social connections. Real problem. Because we don't have the ability. The world's research shows us, 500,000 people at research, we don't have the ability to pause in the moment and identify the emotion. And add ADHD to that, it's even worse. But we can learn that discipline of pausing. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. How do you learn to pause? How do you learn the situations? How do you learn to identify them? Because here's what science tells us. The moment you identify the emotion and give it a name, anger, frustration, Peter, whatever you want to call it, you diminish its power over you. And what do most people with ADHD do? They're like Ferrari engines. The engine is running and the brake isn't going, and the faster they go, the worse the emotion gets. We're going to talk about what that does to the brain. You know, hijacking, rumination, sound familiar? Hyper-focusing on negative thoughts where you're stuck and you're hijacked by the emotion. You got to learn to pause and identify it. It sounds so simple, and it really is conceptually, but as a discipline, it takes hard work to be able to pause, identify the emotion, and shift out of it. The mind's playground. Do you know kids have less play than they've ever had before? Oh, good. I don't have to say anything more. You all know. But why is that so important? Because in play, they learn from a young age how to manipulate objects and then move on to manipulating thoughts, ideas, and concepts. And unstructured play is the most important because you're put in situations where you have to respond and understand the social rules and learn to connect. So when that unstructured play happens, you can start to see where the challenges are. What aren't you getting about getting angry at your friend because he beat you in checkers and you're yelling at him? What aren't you understanding? And you give them feedback. Feedback has to be succinct, quick, and one point at a time. Too many points, there's overwhelm. But on the flip side of that, can you imagine if all you do is pay attention to feedback of what you're doing wrong, as opposed to feedback that shines the light on what you're doing right? It's a whole different mindset. I can assure you that one of the most powerful tools that we have that we can access and are available to at any time is the power to acknowledge. The power to, do you notice I started this session off by acknowledging those people that helped me here? Not because I wanted to get brownie points, because that's a strength that I embrace. That's a value that I embrace, to acknowledge the people that help get me there. Some people with ADHD are afraid to play with others and be an unstructured play. You know why? Because they have a belief that they have to do it by themselves. And playing by yourself is the worst thing you can do, except if you're building imagination on yourself, because the limbic system needs connection with people. It's not the worst thing to be able to imagine on your own, but it's the worst thing if you want to learn how to connect with other people, is to be by yourself. So as we learn to play, look at the demographics of the world. 2 parents working, we're seeing more structured play. So structured play is not bad, but if you take into account what boredom does, why would you put your kid in a boring situation of social connection without finding out, how can I put my son or daughter, or put myself as an adult in a situation where I can integrate something engaging in that social situation? Whose responsibility is that? If you know you're going into that situation, you have to find a way to get engaged. And this is the responsibility of the parent with the kid. And as we get older, I know that if I go to a bank meeting and I hate finances and I got to get that loan, I better be interested in some way, because if I get up and walk out and don't come back, I'll never get the loan. And that's exactly what one of my clients did. He wanted a loan for his business, and he went in there and he said, I got to go to the bathroom, because they were talking about balance sheets or whatever, and he never came back. Never came back. And then he got angry that he didn't get the loan. Doesn't work that way. You've got to be connected. So here's a filtering process. This is the way we look at these executive functions. Simple. You got to pause. How do you pause? We're going to talk about, you have to learn to pay attention to your body. You have to learn to breathe. Most people don't breathe well. We breathe very shallowly. You got to take it in through your nose and out through your mouth. We'll talk about that. Your stomach should protrude. When you don't get the oxygen that your brain needs. 20% of all oxygen is in the prefrontal, in that brain part, right up there. And when you are stressed or angry, guess what that does to your brain in terms of oxygen? Takes it right. So we got to put it back in. Breathing properly is so important. Mindfulness is important, but if you don't learn how to breathe properly, you don't have the foundation. So anytime, and I challenge any of you, here's what research shows. Proper breathing, 2 minutes, 3 times a day, has dramatic impact on academics, social connection, social achievement, and the proof is in a program started by Goldie Hawn. Everybody remember Goldie Hawn, the actress? She started a foundation called Mind Up. They are teaching kids from kindergarten through 12 how to breathe, how to learn mindfulness, how to learn some of the stuff we're talking about here about the different brain. And it's wonderful. Go check it out. You can actually have it integrated into your school system if you make a good enough case. They will come into they will teach you about the brain, so that, can you imagine a 9-year-old going to his teacher, you know, Mrs. B, my amygdala is really off today. And I want to access my prefrontal cortex, but I'm so stressed. Can I go in the corner and breathe? That's what they're doing. And it's working. It's working. So when I pause to pay attention to the prompts, I have to have those prompts, my body, a signal, a visual. I can process it. Sometimes I need to talk it out loud. Sometimes I need to pinpoint the emotion so that it doesn't deregulate me. And how can I manipulate all these things? Now, I want to give you an example. This is one of my clients. I have lots of visuals. I could spend all day showing you their prompts. But this was a visual where she paused and paid attention to the emotion that was getting in her way. And the emotion, this is how she described it. I let her verbally process. So she paused. She said, I have this terrible feeling in the middle of my stomach. And I said, what is it? It feels like a huge boulder that I can't move. So I sent her this. That's not her, but I sent her what I could find. And the moment she saw that boulder, she was able to process, I'm angry at my friends because I went to Australia on an exchange program and I came back and they're not giving me what I need. And they said, oh, and she didn't even realize what she was saying. So you're telling me that the boulder reminds you that you're not able to connect with your friends because they're not giving you what you need. And I repeated that back to her. She said, well, that's not what I meant. Well, what did you mean? I said, they're not connecting with me because they've changed. And there was no contact for months between the two of them. Well, the moment she felt the boulder, she went and had a conversation with them, and it all changed. Just by one picture, because she couldn't regulate the emotion. The boulder was so big, and she hadn't processed it with anyone, that the boulder was holding her back from social connections. So now we're into the mind. The part of you that's the commander of the command center. The story that you pay attention to grows. It actually creates, there's a part of your brain called the reticular activating system, we'll talk about it, that only lets the strongest thoughts through. It doesn't analyze if it's good or bad. It just says, this is the strongest electrical current. I'm going to let it through. And that changes into chemicals which either can catalyze you in terms of serotonin, which makes you feel good, or it can create cortisol, which creates more stress, or adrenaline. And what you pay attention to really does grow if you don't pause to pay attention to what you're paying attention to. So we got to look at the unhealthy story and change it to a healthy story. This is what I was talking about before. The brain is automatically attracted to negativity like Velcro. It sticks. And we got to learn how to be like Teflon. These are two ways that I help my clients remember the negative thoughts and the positive thoughts. Pests. Pests. You know, those pests that diminish, that we tolerate, they diminish our energy. Pressure, terrible on the brain. And when you put pressure and you're a perfectionist, and I know none of you in here are that, I know, but when you're a perfectionist, if I can't do it perfectly, then I won't do it at all. You begin to procrastinate. You're waiting for the perfect plan to just fall out of the sky. And it develops problems, and you get very pessimistic when you can't move forward on a concept called perfectionism, which doesn't exist, because nothing's perfect. You can be excellent. You can talk about the distinction between perfectionism and excellence, and that's what we do, developing your own standards that are practical. Oh, wait, I get to use, hey, how's that, huh? You get to practical. Something is better than nothing. One step is better than no step. I get progress. And when I give myself permission to proceed, which is why I wrote the book, to imagine a possibility. What would happen if? What's the worst that could happen if? And what we realize is when we take an action, we always get a result. It's what we do with the result. We all have revisions of a vision. So if I have a picture in my head and I take an action, I still have to revise it. Isn't it interesting? In the word revision is the word vision. How does one get towards one's vision? By taking action and revising along the way. And the homing pigeons are, if you take a homing pigeon and you put a blindfold around and you take it 1,000 miles away, you can take the blindfold off and it'll find its way back. These are the radar. Possibilities, progress, passion, purpose. We don't pay attention to it nearly enough. So, the mind. Nothing happens without the pause. To learn how to respond rather than react, we have to learn how to pause. Body signals. Paying attention. Do you feel it in your stomach? Do you feel it in your head? Can you pause? Can you identify? Breathing. Now, everybody take your hand and put it on your stomach, breathing. And this was never explained to me. They said you breathe shallowly. What the heck does that mean? I breathe shallow or I breathe deep. If you're breathing properly, you breathe through your nose. You should feel your stomach go out, get nice and tight, and breathe out. Do that for 2 minutes a day. That's how and you know what happens when you do that? Some of you, if you do it 4 or 5 times now, you might even feel a tingle in your brain. You know why? You're giving it the oxygen that it needs. That's how simple that is. And yet, I never did that up until 5 years ago. 20% of the oxygen goes right here. Watch your function, watch the stress dissipate. Naming it, feeling it, etc. But letting go. That's a hard thing for us to do, is letting go. So bottom line is, these are all the things that happen when we pause. But it's essential for emotional intelligence. I want to give you a little science here of how emotional intelligence works. Okay? When you have a dominant negative thought, put your hand back here is the spinal cord, see? You have a dominant negative thought, I can't, I won't, I never could. That goes up through your spinal cord with an electrical current and goes through a part of the brain that is the gatekeeper called the reticular activating system. Fancy name. It doesn't analyze it, it just lets it through. Strongest one. So think about the typical ADDer. I can't, I won't. It's negative, it's hopeless. And I will assure you that this hopelessness that I'm talking about, after a relatively disciplined time of learning to pay attention to what you pay attention to and identifying your strengths and stuff, that negative thought can be turned into a dominant positive thought with work. 5-to-1 ratio, remember, 5 positives to 1 negatives. And let's say we're doing that, but the typical one is the negative. When that negative thought goes through, it turns into chemicals like adrenaline and cortisol. And guess where it goes? It wants to get up to the prefrontal cortex, that's the rational part, but it has to stop along the way at the limbic system. And in that limbic system is a fancy watchdog called the amygdala, the watchdog. And what the watchdog does is says, is this an emergency? Is this good? Is this bad? And if it's an emergency, if imminent danger is on the way, it's stuck right in there. And it turns into cortisol, like I said, which creates more stress, and it stays in your body for 48 hours or longer. Or adrenaline, which creates fight or flight. And if you don't pause, so there you are, you've started here, you're here, you're emotionally hijacked, and you don't pause, pausing allows you to access the part of the brain that allows you to identify it. It's the part of the brain that says, how is this thought serving me? What is this thought? What can I do about it? When we don't pause and we get hijacked by our emotions, we don't have the rational part. The rational part, this part, the prefrontal cortex, the part that makes us human, the most evolved part of the brain, can't communicate with the limbic system. It can't stop it, but it can diminish it. Now, we don't want to get to this point. We don't want to get to the point where the emotion is so strong. We can manage that. It's much harder. We want to get to the situation where we identify the situations and have prompts. This is an actual client said, my heart feels like it's in its stomach. And this is the visual. Now, every time she feels this, she says, most of the time she's angry. She accepts the anger, and the moment she does, it dissipates. And then we ask, well, what do you want to do with that? How do you want to change that? But if we don't pause and we don't have a prompt, she can't access her memory. Remember, accessing visual memory. But she had to do all those things. She had to pause, pay attention to the emotion, process it. She had no memory in there. I asked her what she was thinking. She told me. And here was the visual. This is a 9-year-old kid talks about the domino. He carries dominoes, a domino in his pocket. He has a domino in his room. He's got them in like 6 locations. And the domino's there to remind him he controls the domino that makes them all fall or can hold them up by what he pays attention to. And he actually, whenever he feels negative, he whips the domino out. And it reminds him, I don't want them to ruin my life. Now, he started this when I've been coaching him 4 years. Now he doesn't need the domino anymore. He just says, oh, domino, because he's reinforced